To the first 100 of you who've joined this channel, thank you. As World War II raged on, every front was becoming increasingly bloodier by the day. Yet few would match the bloodshed of the Eastern Front. And as the German war machine started to falter, its leader found himself making some desperate gambits. One such risky decision was Operation Bagration, which sought to destroy the Soviet forces stationed around Ukraine in what is today known as one of the greatest encirclements in military history. But before we dive into that, let's go back to the start. In the beginning, the German blitzkrieg through the Soviet Union had been pretty successful. Kiev had fallen in just 3 months, and by September 1941, the Germans had advanced over 600 kilometers into Ukrainian territory. Yet as winter approached, their luck seemed to run out. By December 1941, the Battle of Moscow was raging, and the once unstoppable German war machine seemed to have finally met its match. So with 2 fronts now open against them, the Germans decided to launch one final offensive before winter set in. Operation Barbarossa. This attack would become one of the deadliest of the entire war, and even earned the ire of Hitler himself. Let me explain. On December 5, 1941, the German troops began their advance on the Soviet forces surrounding the city of Rostov-on-Don. Now, this may not mean much to you right now, but trust me, this location will come up again. Anyway, the assault came as a surprise to the Soviets, and after 3 days of heavy fighting, the Germans were able to break through the lines. Seeing this, the Germans pressed their attack and soon forced the Soviets to abandon Rostov-on-Don. But while this initial assault had been somewhat successful, the real objective of the German offensive was still yet to come. The true prize of the battle was the city of Stalingrad, which lay almost 800 kilometers from the front lines. It was here that the German leadership believed they could deal a death blow to the Soviet war effort. And so, the race for Stalingrad began. As the Germans pushed forward, they were met with fierce resistance at every turn. Whole divisions of Soviet soldiers fought tooth and nail to slow the German advance, buying time for the rest of the army to regroup and prepare for defense. This was especially true around Stalingrad itself, where General Vasily Chukov had made his last stand. But despite the heroic efforts of the Soviet defenders, the Germans were slowly but surely making ground. And as they closed in on their objective, the pressure was beginning to tell. On February 2, 1943, the Germans managed to penetrate the outer defenses of Stalingrad. And just 2 weeks later, they broke into the city itself. With the situation looking increasingly dire, the Soviet leadership knew they had to act fast. On February 23, 1943, Stalin issued a decree that ordered all able-bodied men between the ages of 16 and 62 stay in the city and fight until their very last breath. The order also called for the creation of a special militia force consisting of women, teenagers, and the elderly. These brave souls would take up arms alongside veteran soldiers to form an army of almost 30,000 men. The goal was simple: recapture Stalingrad and save the Soviet Union. The Soviets launched their counterattack on February 27, 1943. While it initially caught the Germans off guard, the invaders quickly regrouped and launched a series of brutal attacks against the city. For the next 5 months, the 2 sides fought bitterly across the ruins of Stalingrad. The Germans had the advantage in terms of firepower, but the Soviets were able to make up for this with sheer determination. It seemed that neither side was willing to give an inch, but it was clear that the battle would be decided by firepower. The Germans had brought their big guns to bear against the city. They laid siege to Stalingrad day and night, bombing the living hell out of the city. The Soviets were able to return fire, but they simply didn't have the same capacity as the Germans. Soon, the city was in ruins, but the Soviet defenders refused to give up. Finally, on November 1943, the Germans made a fatal error. They left the city via its southern flank, unaware that this was precisely where the bulk of the Soviet forces were positioned. In a matter of days, the Soviet forces had surrounded the city. The Germans inside were trapped. What followed was one of the greatest acts of revenge in military history. Over the next 2 months, the Soviet forces bombarded the German positions with artillery fire. Day and night, the Germans were subjected to a storm of shells. Food and water were scarce, and the cold was biting. Eventually, the Germans were forced to surrender. When the dust had settled, the Germans had lost more than 800,000 men. The Red Army had won one of the most important battles of the war. But at what cost? The battle had taken a terrible toll on the Soviet people. Entire families had been wiped out. Cities and villages lay in ruins and the economy was in sharp decline. But the Soviets were not a people to be kept down. They began the long process of rebuilding their lives and their country. This victory at Stalingrad marked a turning point in the war. From this point forward, the Germans would never again be able to mount a major offensive on the Eastern Front. Instead, they were forced into a long and bloody war of attrition that eventually resulted in their defeat. Now, with the German focus on the Soviet front lines, something interesting happened in the Pacific. Japan decided to take its chance and launch a major offensive of its own. Their plan was simple. They would send a large force of troops to the island of Tarawa and establish a base there from which they could launch attacks on the American forces in the region. However, what Japan didn't know was that the Americans had already anticipated their move and had stationed a large force of troops on the island to defend it. What followed was one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific. For 4 long days, the Japanese and Americans fought each other tooth and nail. The Japanese were eventually forced to retreat, but not before inflicting heavy casualties on the Americans. Despite the heavy losses, the Americans were able to hold on to the island, which prevented the Japanese from establishing a base there. From there, the Allies were able to launch a series of attacks that gradually pushed the Japanese back. In Europe, the tide had also turned against the Axis powers. In June 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy and began their advance eastward. By August, Paris had been liberated and the Germans were in full retreat. In Italy, the Allies had also made significant gains. By September, the Germans had been pushed all the way back to the Arno River. With the war clearly going badly for them, the Germans began to look for a way out. On October, Hitler agreed to meet with the leaders of the United Kingdom, France, and the United States at a place called Chateau di Fontainebleau to discuss peace terms. However, the meeting never took place. The Allies had rejected Hitler's offer to negotiate and had instead launched a massive offensive that drove the Germans all the way back to the Rhine River. With the war clearly lost, Hitler and his top generals met together at his Wolf-Isleir headquarters in July 1945 to discuss their options. Some of the generals, including Field Marshal Wilhelm List and Alfred Jodl, argued that the only honorable course of action was to fight to the very end. However, others, including Grand Admiral Erich Raeder and Air Marshal Erhard Milch, believed that the war was already lost and that they should try to negotiate a peace deal with the Allies. Ultimately, Hitler sided with the majority and decided to continue fighting. On July 20, 1945, Hitler addressed his top generals and told them that he had no intention of surrendering. He said, "I will not run away like a frightened dog, and I will not sign any disgraceful peace. I will fight till the last man and the last bullet." However, as the weeks went by, it became clear that this was not a realistic strategy. The Germans were being pushed back on all fronts, and it was only a matter of time before they were defeated. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered to the Allies. The war in Europe was finally over, but the fighting would continue in the Pacific for another 6 months. All right, everyone, what did you think? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an upload. We'll catch you guys next time. This is just the beginning. If you're still watching, drop it in the comments to honor history and keep stories like these alive.